son zesfenu meden
So we have to be a bit cautious when we talk about anything to do with Plato. He's so famous and already so influential in the generation after his life that so many different opinions circulated about him, so many stories were around in the oral tradition, that it's a real challenge to sift through the material now. So maybe it's safer to ask how we think we know about Plato, not just how we do. But we do have a lot to go on compared to some figures in antiquity, for example, the pre-Socratic philosophers we've talked about before here, because in Plato's case, we have between 26 and 29 genuine, extensive texts that he wrote. 26 to 29, that is, that are generally regarded today as actually by him. Probably composed over a period of about 50 years, between 399 and 347 BC. These are, of course, the dialogues, often called the dialogues of Socrates, Plato's teacher Socrates, because almost all of them feature Socrates as a central character. In total, the dialogues sum up to roughly 500,000 words of genuine material in ancient Greek. There are other dialogues in the corpus, which you'll find in a standard collection, like Cooper and Hutchinson's translation. But these texts that are attributed to Plato in antiquity attract a lot of doubt today. So people think maybe they were written by somebody else or some other people and got attached to Plato's name on purpose, or maybe in some cases without having been written with that intention. But basically, of the genuine dialogues, Plato's teacher Socrates looks like a central character in most of them, and he's at least implied to be there in all but one major dialogue, the Laws, the last one that Plato wrote, we're told. So it's pretty fair to talk about them all as Socratic dialogues. Plato hardly ever mentions himself in his dialogues, and he talks only through his characters. So it's important to note that his own view never really emerges clearly. We talk a lot like Plato says this and Plato thinks that, but we maybe should be more cautious because it's true that sometimes Plato's protagonists, like Socrates, say something and nobody refutes it, and it sort of feels like it must be Plato's opinion, but that's not really explicit. Unlike some other philosophers, say his most famous student Aristotle, Plato never just comes out and says, here's how it is. The dialogues that we're talking about as a primary source were, of course, written down thousands of years ago, so you might wonder how we even have them. So they're available today mostly through the copies of copies of copies of copies that were made through the Middle Ages, the manuscript tradition. But we're lucky in having, in Plato's case, some corroborating evidence from much earlier ancient papyri and material sources. So sometimes in, for example, the sands of Egypt, you'll find somewhere around the Delta or further in Upper Egypt a copy of a little snippet of a Platonic dialogue that somebody wrote down and actually survived on papyrus, still not from Plato's own lifetime, but from, say, the early Roman Empire. Which you can then check against the manuscript copies that were made through the Middle Ages, and often that's encouraging, that it shows you that the copies are pretty good. The dialogues aren't the only way that we know about Plato, though. They're the fundamental evidence, but we also have a corpus of letters that were attributed to him in antiquity. Scholars today doubt that most of them are actually by Plato, but there's one in particular, the 7th letter, that a lot of scholars think might be genuine, even though that's still debated, and it's really interesting. So we might get to do a deeper dive on that letter in another episode. We also have information about Plato from other philosophers and his contemporaries, most famously his own most celebrated student Aristotle, who sometimes talks about Plato and mentions his views, although sometimes this is vague, and there's a lot of debate about how seriously to take Aristotle's testimony. It seems to me at least like we should give it a lot of weight, since Aristotle knew Plato personally, and obviously, though he has his own agenda, takes care to inform his students of what he thinks is important about Plato's school of thought. Something else we could talk about more in another case. We also have this fantastic ancient biographical tradition full of anecdotes that probably originate in a speech that Plato's nephew gave. This is Speusippus, one of the successors and Plato's immediate successor, as head of the academy, which we talked about in the episode on the Socratic movements. Speusippus gave a funeral oration in Plato's honor where he talked about his life, and there's a good case that this is one of the important sources for the biographical tradition of stories that circulated about Plato later. We don't have that funeral oration, but we have some text from mostly hundreds of years later that take us through some of the stories. Maybe the best known is Diogenes Laertius, who offers a kind of biography and doxography of ancient philosophy. But there's also Olympiodorus of Alexandria's lectures on the Platonic Alcibiades from the 6th century CE. This is the last pagan professor of Platonism in Alexandria, where he takes us through a life of Plato, and there's some other sources like that. So I'm going to take you through those stories a little bit later in this episode because they're a lot of fun. And last but not least, we also have some material evidence, archaeological sources that may give us some information about how Plato was perceived in antiquity as a kind of control on that literary record. So, for example, Stephen Miller has argued that the Berkeley Plato, this bust, which you can see on screen if you're watching this on video, may be a 2nd century replica of an original that was made during Plato's life. And though there's lots of debate about whether the inscription is ancient, it may or may not be, it is interesting to see what the inscription that went with the bust in antiquity might have been. The inscription has 2 short quotes from Plato. On the one hand, the quote that every soul is immortal, and on the other hand, the quote theos and aitios, that the god is not responsible, but choices are up to the individual, from Republic 10. The first quote about the immortal soul is literally from Plato's Phaedrus, but is a theme that comes up frequently through the dialogues. So to whatever degree we can trust that inscription, it does give us a sort of interesting angle on how Plato was perceived in his own lifetime, if you think that the immortality of the soul and the freedom of individual human choice were seen as key Platonic themes. So throughout this episode, I'll draw on some other sources that are contemporary. Robin Waterfield's excellent new biography of Plato of Athens, 2023, which you can see on screen again if you're watching this on video. Carlo Natali's discussion of Aristotle's life and school, and John Dillon's The Errors of Plato on the Old Academy, which you can also explore more as I hope we'll have a chance to get into the Old Academy and Plato's successors in due course. If you're interested in scholarly overviews of Plato's view on philosophy in general, there's a new edition of the Oxford Handbook of Plato edited by Gail Fine, which gives a broad introduction to almost every key theme in Plato. I can also recommend Ruby Blondell's book, The Play of Character in Plato's Dialogues, to offer a sense of the literary side of Plato. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Plato by Richard Kraut, one of the best-known Plato scholars today, is excellent and is peer-reviewed like all Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy articles are. So those are nice starting points. Obviously, there's dozens more that we could talk about. But if you'd like to go deeper, those are some places to start. One theme to think about before we get into the biography, and in the following episode after this, start to look at Plato's ideas, is the one I mentioned before, that Plato makes it difficult to simply ascribe any position to himself because of the dramatic form of his argument. Again, he is a kind of playwright, putting characters on the page who ask questions of each other and investigate. And that sort of investigation as a pattern, as an inspiration, is really Plato's legacy more than any particular answer to the questions. So For instance, in a volume called Who Speaks for Plato, edited by Gerald Press, we can talk about how Plato forces us as readers to think about how challenging it is to do philosophy responsibly, and that he really teaches us by refusing to just do the job for us. He doesn't give us answers. He doesn't allow us to say that Plato has come up with an authoritative position. Sometimes people read him like he does, but again, it might be worth being cautious about that. Coming up next, we'll talk about Plato's life and the ancient biographies.
No son